5 nannies quit after meeting this child, each one leaving in frustration and defeat. The boy seemed impossible to handle, driving away every caregiver with his relentless behavior. But when a humble maid stepped into his world, she uncovered something extraordinary that no one else had bothered to look for. What she discovered would change everything, not just for the child, but for an entire family that had nearly given up hope. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of the Henderson mansion, its golden rays filtering through towering windows that overlooked the pristine gardens of Beacon Hill. At 38, Michael Henderson commanded respect in every boardroom he entered. As the founder and CEO of Henderson Digital Solutions, he had built a technology empire from nothing, transforming a small startup in his garage into a multinational corporation worth over $2 billion. His name appeared regularly in business magazines, and his company's innovative software had revolutionized how hospitals managed patient data across 3 continents. Yet for all his professional achievements, Michael felt like a complete failure in the one role that mattered most. Standing in his home office on the 3rd floor, he stared out at the perfectly manicured lawn where his 7-year-old son should have been playing. Instead, the yard remained empty, just like the silence that had settled over their home like a heavy blanket. The house itself was a testament to success. 14 rooms spread across 4 floors, each one decorated by Boston's most sought-after interior designers. Persian rugs covered hardwood floors that gleamed under crystal chandeliers. Original paintings adorned the walls, and every piece of furniture had been carefully selected for both beauty and comfort. The kitchen boasted professional-grade appliances that most restaurants would envy, while the library contained first-edition books that collectors would kill for. But none of that wealth could solve the problem that kept Michael awake at night. His son David was, by all accounts, an impossible child. Not impossible in the way that normal children could be challenging, but impossible in a way that had driven 5 experienced nannies to quit their jobs in frustration. The boy seemed to possess an almost supernatural ability to find the exact thing that would push each caregiver past their breaking point. The first nanny, Mrs. Patterson, had lasted exactly 3 days. She was a stern woman in her 50s with 20 years of experience caring for wealthy families. Her references were impeccable, and she came highly recommended by the agency. On her first morning, she arrived at 7 sharp, clipboard in hand, ready to establish a routine that would transform David into a well-behaved child. By noon, she was sitting in Michael's office with tears in her eyes, her carefully pinned hair disheveled and her professional composure completely shattered. David had started the morning by hiding every single one of her belongings. Not just moving them, but creating an elaborate treasure hunt that sent her searching through every room in the house. When she finally found her purse hanging from the chandelier in the dining room, she discovered that David had somehow managed to rearrange all the contents in perfect alphabetical order. Her car keys were buried in a flower pot, her reading glasses were taped under the kitchen table, and her cell phone was hidden inside the piano bench with a note that read, "You have to play a song to get it back." But that was just the beginning. During lunch, David had somehow convinced the cook to prepare nothing but desserts, claiming that Mrs. Patterson had specifically requested birthday cake for lunch because it was National Backwards Day. When she tried to correct this, David produced a handwritten note that perfectly mimicked her handwriting, complete with her signature. The forgery was so convincing that even Michael had trouble telling it apart from her real writing. The final straw came when Mrs. Patterson discovered that David had rewired the intercom system throughout the house so that every time someone pressed a button, it played a recording of her singing off-key in the shower. She had no idea when or how he had recorded it, but the sound of her voice warbling through Amazing Grace echoed through every room until the maintenance staff could figure out how to disconnect the system. The second nanny, Mr. Rodriguez, was a different approach entirely. Michael had decided that perhaps a male authority figure was what David needed. Mr. Rodriguez was a former military man who specialized in troubled children. He arrived wearing a crisp uniform and carrying himself with the bearing of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. His philosophy was simple: structure, discipline, and clear consequences would transform any child into a model citizen. David lasted 2 weeks with Mr. Rodriguez, which initially seemed promising. The man established rigid schedules, mandatory exercise periods, and a point system for good behavior. For the first few days, it appeared to be working. David followed the rules, completed his assignments, and even helped with household chores without complaint. Michael began to hope that they had finally found the solution. But David was simply studying his opponent, learning every detail of Mr. Rodriguez's routine and personality. On a Tuesday morning, Mr. Rodriguez woke up to discover that his room had been completely transformed into a jungle. David had somehow acquired dozens of tropical plants, bird sound recordings, and even a small waterfall feature that he had constructed in the corner. Vines hung from the ceiling, exotic flowers bloomed in every corner, and the humidity had been raised to uncomfortable levels. When Mr. Rodriguez tried to leave his room to confront David, he found that the door handle had been replaced with a banana. A note taped to the door explained that he was now living in his natural habitat and should feel free to swing from branch to branch. The boy had even gone so far as to leave a pile of bananas outside the door as breakfast appropriate for his species. The psychological warfare continued for days. David would follow every rule to the letter while simultaneously finding ways to turn Mr. Rodriguez's military precision against him. He would complete his morning exercises exactly as instructed, but somehow managed to do them in locations that caused maximum embarrassment. The man would find David doing jumping jacks in the middle of the formal dining room during an important business dinner, or performing push-ups in the front yard where all the neighbors could see. The breaking point came when David organized what he called a Military Appreciation Day and invited all the neighborhood children to participate in war games on the front lawn. Mr. Rodriguez woke up to find 30 children in camouflage face paint conducting elaborate battle scenarios while using water guns filled with washable paint. The children had barricaded themselves behind overturned patio furniture and were defending the compound against an imaginary enemy invasion. When Mr. Rodriguez tried to restore order, the children saluted him and shouted, "Yes, sir, General Rodriguez," in perfect unison. David had apparently spent weeks training them to respond to military commands, and they proceeded to demonstrate their tactical knowledge by implementing a complex flanking maneuver that somehow resulted in Mr. Rodriguez being completely surrounded and covered in pink paint. The third nanny was Dr. Sarah Chen, a child psychologist with a PhD in behavioral therapy. Michael had decided that perhaps David's behavior stemmed from deeper psychological issues that required professional intervention. Dr. Chen came armed with assessment tools, behavior modification techniques, and a treatment plan designed to address what she assumed were underlying emotional problems. She lasted exactly 1 week. Dr. Chen's approach was to understand the root causes of David's behavior through careful observation and therapeutic conversations. She set up structured play sessions designed to reveal his inner emotional state and began implementing a reward system based on positive reinforcement theory. Her office was filled with educational toys, art supplies, and assessment materials that she believed would help unlock the mystery of David's troubled psyche. David, however, turned the tables completely. Instead of being analyzed, he began analyzing her. During their first session, he asked her why she touched her necklace every time she felt uncertain about his answers. By the second day, he was accurately predicting her responses to his behavior and had begun keeping detailed notes on her body language and speech patterns. The situation reached its peak when Dr. Chen arrived one morning to find that David had set up his own psychological practice in the playroom. He had created official-looking certificates declaring himself a certified kid doctor and had arranged the furniture to replicate a professional therapy office. When she entered the room, David was wearing a tiny lab coat and thick glasses, holding a clipboard and speaking in a perfect imitation of her professional voice. "Please have a seat, Dr. Chen," David said seriously, gesturing to a small chair while he sat behind a makeshift desk. "I'd like to discuss your obvious anxiety about your professional competence and your need to constantly validate your authority through the manipulation of children's behavior." He then proceeded to conduct a therapy session with her, asking probing questions about her childhood, her relationship with authority figures, and her fear of professional failure. His observations were so accurate and his imitation of therapeutic techniques so precise that Dr. Chen found herself actually answering his questions before she realized what was happening. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The final straw came when David presented her with a bill for consultation services and suggested that she might benefit from weekly sessions to address her compulsive need to fix people who don't want to be fixed. He had even created a business card that read David Henderson, Kid Whisperer, and offered her a package deal for ongoing therapy. The fourth nanny was Mrs. O'Brien, a grandmother of 8 who believed that old-fashioned love and patience could solve any child's problems. She arrived with homemade cookies, knitting supplies, and an endless repertoire of stories from her own child-rearing experience. Her philosophy was simple: every child just needed someone to listen to them and show them unconditional love. David broke her heart in the gentlest possible way. Instead of pranks or elaborate schemes, he simply became the perfect grandchild. He listened to her stories with rapt attention, helped her with her knitting, and even asked to learn her secret cookie recipe. For 2 weeks, Mrs. O'Brien thought she had found her calling. She told everyone who would listen about the sweet little boy who just needed some grandmother's love to bring out his best qualities. But slowly, David began to reveal the depth of his loneliness and pain in ways that were too much for her kind heart to bear. He would ask her why his mother had to die, why his father worked so much, and whether she thought there was something wrong with him that made people leave. His questions were delivered with such genuine vulnerability that Mrs. O'Brien found herself crying herself to sleep every night. The breaking point came when David asked her if she was going to leave him too, just like all the others. When she assured him that she would never abandon him, he quietly explained that everyone always said that, but they always left anyway. He then asked if she could teach him how to be the kind of child that people wanted to stay with, because he was tired of being alone. Mrs. O'Brien lasted one more day before she came to Michael's office in tears, explaining that she couldn't bear to be another person who would eventually disappoint this child. She felt that her presence was giving him false hope, and she couldn't promise to stay forever when she knew that someday age or circumstances would force her to leave. The fifth nanny was James Morrison, a recent graduate from a prestigious childcare program who specialized in gifted and challenging children. He was young, energetic, and convinced that modern childcare techniques combined with technology could solve any behavioral problem. He arrived with tablets, educational apps, and a detailed plan for channeling David's obvious intelligence into productive activities. James lasted 3 days, but not because David defeated him. Instead, David taught him something that fundamentally changed how he viewed his chosen profession. On his first morning, James set up what he called a learning laboratory in David's room. He had educational games designed to challenge gifted children, programming software for kids, and interactive lessons that adapted to the child's learning speed. His plan was to keep David's mind so engaged with constructive activities that there would be no time or energy for disruptive behavior. David participated enthusiastically, mastering every program and solving every puzzle with an ease that both impressed and concerned James. By the end of the first day, David had completed educational modules that were designed for children 3 years older. By the second day, he was creating his own programs and had somehow hacked into the educational software to modify the games. But on the third morning, David asked James a question that stopped him cold: "Why do you think keeping my brain busy will make me happy?" When James tried to explain the benefits of intellectual stimulation and academic achievement, David interrupted him gently. "I can learn anything you want me to learn," the boy said quietly. "I can be as smart as you want me to be. But being smart doesn't make the loneliness go away. It just makes you better at understanding why you're lonely." David then demonstrated this by explaining, with startling clarity, exactly what James was trying to accomplish with his educational approach. He broke down the psychological theory behind keeping troubled children occupied with mental challenges, analyzed the flaws in the methodology, and predicted with perfect accuracy why this approach would ultimately fail with him. "You're trying to fix my behavior by changing what I do," David explained. "But my behavior isn't the problem. My behavior is just what happens when a kid who thinks too much doesn't have anyone who wants to know what he's thinking about." James left that afternoon, not in frustration or defeat, but in recognition that this child needed something far beyond what any traditional childcare approach could provide. He told Michael that David wasn't a problem to be solved, but a person to be understood, and that whoever could connect with him on that level would discover something extraordinary. After the fifth nanny's departure, Michael found himself completely at a loss. He had tried every approach, hired every type of professional, and spent tens of thousands of dollars on experts who all reached the same conclusion: David was too intelligent, too lonely, and too damaged by loss to respond to conventional methods. The boy had been only 3 when his mother died in a skiing accident, and in the 4 years since, he had grown increasingly isolated despite Michael's desperate attempts to provide him with proper care. The mansion felt more like a museum than a home. David spent most of his time alone in his room, reading books that were far beyond his grade level or working on projects that no one else understood. He would emerge for meals, perfectly polite and well-mannered, but the conversation felt forced and artificial. Michael could see the intelligence burning behind his son's eyes, but he had no idea how to reach the child who lived behind that brilliant mind. The isolation was affecting both of them. Michael threw himself into work with even greater intensity, partly because the company demanded his attention, but mostly because he felt helpless in his own home. Board meetings and product launches were problems he could solve. His son was a puzzle that seemed to have no solution. The house staff tried their best to help, but they were hired to maintain the property, not to provide emotional support for a grieving child. The cook prepared David's favorite meals, the groundskeeper let him help with gardening projects, and the driver told him stories during trips to school. But everyone maintained the professional distance that was expected in their positions, and David seemed to understand instinctively that these relationships had boundaries. School provided no relief. David's teachers consistently reported that he completed his work quickly and accurately, but that he seemed disconnected from his classmates. He wasn't disruptive or difficult in the classroom, but he also wasn't engaged or happy. He would finish his assignments and then sit quietly, reading or drawing, until the day ended. When other children tried to include him in their games, he would participate politely but without enthusiasm. The parent-teacher conferences were always the same. David was academically gifted, socially isolated, and emotionally distant. The teachers were concerned but had no solutions to offer. They suggested tutoring for advanced students, counseling for social skills, or perhaps a different school environment. Michael had tried all of these approaches without success. The loneliness in the house was palpable. Evenings were the worst, when Michael would come home from work to find David sitting alone in the library, surrounded by books but clearly lost in thoughts that he shared with no one. They would eat dinner together in the formal dining room, making polite conversation about school and work, but both of them seemed to be going through the motions of a relationship rather than actually connecting. Michael knew that David was brilliant. The boy had taught himself to read before he turned 4, had mastered basic mathematics concepts before kindergarten, and could hold conversations about complex topics that amazed the adults around him. But intelligence without connection seemed to be more of a burden than a gift. David understood things that other children his age couldn't even imagine, which made it even harder for him to find common ground with his peers. The death of David's mother had created a wound that neither of them knew how to heal. Elizabeth had been the heart of their family, the one who could make David laugh until his sides hurt and who had possessed an intuitive understanding of how to challenge his mind while nurturing his emotional needs. She had been working on her PhD in child psychology when she died, and she had understood better than anyone how to help a gifted child navigate the complexities of growing up different from everyone around him. Michael had loved his wife deeply, but he had always relied on her to bridge the emotional gaps in their family. He was good at providing financial security, making important decisions, and solving practical problems. Elizabeth had been the one who could translate David's complex thoughts into conversations that brought them closer together. Without her, both father and son were lost in their own grief, unable to find a way back to each other. The guilt ate at Michael daily. He knew that David needed more than expensive toys, private tutors, and a beautiful home. The boy needed someone who could see past his difficult behavior to the lonely, brilliant child underneath. But every attempt to find that person had failed, and Michael was beginning to wonder if such a person even existed. As autumn settled over Boston, Michael made a decision that would change everything, though he had no way of knowing it at the time. The latest agency had called to say they had no more candidates to suggest, and Michael had finally accepted that traditional childcare solutions weren't going to work for his family. Instead of hiring another nanny, he decided to increase the household staff and hoped that the combination of multiple people could provide David with the attention and care that no single caregiver had been able to offer. That's when Maria Santos entered their lives. Maria Santos stepped off the bus at the corner of Beacon Street, clutching a worn leather purse that contained everything she owned of value. At 28, she carried herself with a quiet dignity that spoke of someone who had learned to find strength in difficult circumstances. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore a navy blue dress that was clean and pressed despite being several years old. She had purchased it specifically for job interviews, saving for months to afford something that looked professional enough for the wealthy neighborhoods where she hoped to find work. The walk to the Henderson mansion took 15 minutes, during which Maria observed everything around her with the careful attention of someone who had learned that details mattered. The tree-lined streets spoke of old money and established families. The houses grew larger as she walked, their manicured lawns and elaborate gardens maintained by crews of professional landscapers. She passed joggers in expensive athletic wear, dog walkers managing perfectly groomed pets, and delivery trucks bringing fresh flowers and gourmet groceries to households that could afford such luxuries. Maria had grown up in a different world entirely. The daughter of immigrants from El Salvador, she had spent her childhood in a cramped apartment in East Boston, where her mother worked double shifts as a hospital cleaner and her father labored in construction until an injury forced him into early retirement. Money had always been tight, but her parents had taught her that honest work was its own reward and that treating people with respect was more valuable than any material possession. She had put herself through community college while working nights at a hotel, cleaning rooms, and learning English from the business travelers who stayed there. Her dream had been to become a teacher, but financial pressures forced her to leave school during her second year to help support her family when her father's medical bills became overwhelming. Since then, she had worked a series of jobs that required no formal education but demanded the kind of work ethic and attention to detail that her parents had instilled in her from an early age. The Henderson mansion loomed before her like something from a magazine. 3 stories of red brick and white columns, with bay windows that reflected the morning sun and gardens that looked like they belonged in a botanical conservatory. Maria had cleaned houses before, but nothing approaching this scale or grandeur. For a moment, she felt intimidated by the sheer size of the place and wondered if she was making a mistake by applying for a position so far outside her experience. The job posting had been unusual. Instead of requesting a nanny or childcare provider, the family was looking for additional household staff to help manage daily operations. The salary was generous, almost double what Maria had been earning at her previous position, and the requirements seemed straightforward: maintaining cleanliness throughout the house, assisting with meal preparation, and providing general support for family operations. What struck her as odd was a single line at the bottom of the posting that read "patience and understanding required for unique family circumstances." Maria had responded to the advertisement not because she thought she was the most qualified candidate, but because she desperately needed the income. Her father's condition had worsened over the past year, requiring expensive medications that insurance only partially covered. Her mother had developed arthritis that made her hospital job increasingly painful, and Maria knew it was only a matter of time before she would be forced to retire. The Henderson position offered the kind of financial stability that could change everything for her family. The interview process had been surprisingly brief. She had met with Mrs. Patterson, the household manager, who seemed more interested in Maria's references and reliability than in her specific experience with wealthy families. The questions focused on her ability to work independently, her comfort level with maintaining confidentiality, and her willingness to adapt to unusual situations. When Mrs. Patterson asked if she was comfortable working around children, Maria had mentioned her experience helping to raise her younger cousins and her natural affinity for connecting with kids. What Mrs. Patterson didn't mention during the interview was the revolving door of childcare providers who had preceded Maria's arrival. She didn't explain the specific challenges presented by the Henderson family's only child, or the reason why the household staff had been instructed to maintain professional distance from the boy who lived in the rooms upstairs. Maria was hired as cleaning staff, pure and simple, with instructions to focus on maintaining the common areas and guest rooms while avoiding unnecessary interaction with family members. Her first week passed quietly. Maria arrived each morning at 7, entering through the service entrance and beginning her duties in the formal living areas where family members rarely spent time. The house was a marvel of architectural design and expensive furnishings, but it felt strangely empty despite its grandeur. She would work for hours without seeing or hearing another person, moving through rooms that looked like museum displays rather than spaces where people actually lived. The cleaning itself was surprisingly easy. Despite the size of the house, most rooms appeared to be rarely used. Dust accumulated on furniture that showed no signs of wear, and carpets remained pristine because no one walked on them. Maria began to realize that the family lived in only a small portion of their enormous home, leaving vast areas untouched from one day to the next. It was efficient from a cleaning perspective, but it struck her as profoundly sad that such a beautiful space felt so lifeless. She caught glimpses of Michael Henderson during her second week, usually as he was leaving for work or returning in the evening. He moved through the house with the focused efficiency of someone who had important places to be, acknowledging the staff with polite nods but rarely engaging in conversation. Maria could see the exhaustion in his posture and the tension in his shoulders. He carried himself like a man who was carrying a burden that was slowly wearing him down. The other household staff spoke about Mr. Henderson with a mixture of respect and sympathy. Everyone agreed that he was a fair employer who paid well and treated his employees with dignity, but they also recognized that he was struggling with personal challenges that went far beyond their responsibilities to address. Mrs. Patterson had worked for the family since before David was born, and she spoke fondly of the days when Mrs. Henderson had been alive and the house had felt like a real home. It was during her third week that Maria first encountered David. She was cleaning the library on a Tuesday morning, carefully dusting the thousands of books that lined the walls from floor to ceiling, when she heard soft footsteps on the hardwood floor behind her. She turned to see a small boy standing in the doorway, watching her with intense curiosity. He appeared to be about 7 years old, with dark hair that fell across his forehead and eyes that seemed far too serious for his age. "I'm sorry," Maria said, immediately setting down her cleaning supplies. "I didn't know anyone was using this room. I can come back later." The boy didn't respond immediately, instead studying her with the kind of focused attention that adults usually reserve for important business decisions. Finally, he spoke in a voice that was quiet but surprisingly articulate. "You're new," he observed. "You're not like the others." Maria wasn't sure how to respond to that assessment. "I'm Maria," she said, offering a small smile. "I help keep the house clean." "You must be David." "How do you know my name?" he asked, though his tone suggested curiosity rather than suspicion. "Mrs. Patterson mentioned you when she was showing me around," Maria explained. "She said you like to read. This must be one of your favorite rooms." David stepped further into the library, his bare feet silent on the polished floor. He was wearing pajamas even though it was nearly 10 in the morning, and Maria noticed that he moved with the careful deliberation of someone who was accustomed to being alone. "I read here sometimes," he admitted. "But mostly I just sit and think." Something in his tone touched Maria's heart. There was a loneliness in his voice that reminded her of her youngest cousin, who had struggled to make friends after her family moved to a new neighborhood. "What do you like to think about?" she asked, genuinely curious. The question seemed to surprise David. He tilted his head slightly, as if trying to determine whether she was asking out of politeness or actual interest. "Lots of things," he said carefully. "How things work. Why people do what they do. Whether fish get thirsty." Maria couldn't help but smile at the last item on his list. Whether fish get thirsty? That's an interesting question. What do you think? "I think they probably don't," David said, warming slightly to the topic. Since they live in water and they breathe it in everything. But then I wonder if they can taste the difference between different kinds of water, like how we can taste the difference between different kinds of drinks. It was such an unexpectedly sophisticated observation from such a young child that Maria found herself truly intrigued. That's a really smart way to think about it, she said. I never would have thought of it that way. David's eyes lit up with genuine pleasure at her response. Really? Most people just tell me I ask too many questions. I don't think there's such a thing as too many questions, Maria replied. Questions are how we learn new things. And you seem to have very interesting questions. For the next 20 minutes, Maria found herself engaged in the most fascinating conversation she'd had in months. David asked her about her cleaning supplies and whether different chemicals worked better on different types of dirt. He wanted to know if she had noticed that dust accumulated differently in various rooms, and whether she thought the patterns might reveal something about air circulation throughout the house. His questions demonstrated not just curiosity, but a level of analytical thinking that was remarkable for someone his age. What struck Maria most was how hungry David seemed for genuine conversation. He wasn't showing off his intelligence or trying to impress her with his knowledge. Instead, he appeared genuinely interested in her perspective and eager to share his own observations with someone who would listen without judgment. When she finally had to return to her work, David thanked her for talking with him with a politeness that seemed both natural and heartbreaking. That evening, Maria found herself thinking about the encounter as she rode the bus home to her family's apartment. There had been something about David that stayed with her, a combination of exceptional intelligence and profound isolation that made her want to understand more about his situation. She had worked around children before, but never one who seemed so eager for adult conversation or so capable of engaging at such a sophisticated level. Over the next few days, Maria began to encounter David regularly during her morning cleaning routine. He seemed to have developed a schedule that allowed him to be in whatever room she was working in, always appearing quietly and never interfering with her duties. Instead, he would settle into a corner with a book or a notebook, occasionally making observations or asking questions that revealed his remarkable mind. Maria learned that David was homeschooled, though he seemed to do most of his learning independently. He mentioned tutors who came to the house for specific subjects, but he described these sessions with a lack of enthusiasm that suggested they were more obligation than opportunity. When she asked about friends his own age, David's expression grew shuttered, and he changed the subject with the skill of someone who had learned to avoid painful topics. The boy's intelligence became more apparent with each conversation. He had taught himself basic programming by reading computer manuals, could solve mathematical problems that challenged high school students, and had read literature that most adults found difficult. But for all his intellectual gifts, David seemed to lack the social and emotional connections that were essential for healthy development. He was like a brilliant flower trying to grow in soil that lacked the nutrients necessary for proper flourishing. Maria began to understand why the previous caregivers had struggled with David. His intelligence made it impossible to treat him like a typical 7-year-old, but his emotional needs were still those of a child who had experienced significant loss. He required someone who could engage with his mind while also nurturing his heart, a combination that demanded both intellectual curiosity and emotional wisdom. One morning during her 4th week, Maria discovered David sitting on the floor of the music room, surrounded by the pieces of a dismantled piano. Her first instinct was panic, assuming that he had destroyed an expensive instrument and would get into serious trouble. But as she looked more closely, she realized that the pieces were arranged in careful groupings, and David was studying them with the focused attention of a scientist conducting research. "David, what are you doing?" she asked, trying to keep her voice calm despite her concern about the consequences he might face. "I wanted to understand how the sound works," he explained without looking up from his examination. "I read about it in a book, but I couldn't really understand until I could see all the parts. See how these hammers hit the strings when you press the keys? And how the sound board amplifies the vibrations." Maria knelt down beside him, studying the organized chaos of piano components. "This is incredible," she said, and she meant it. "You figured out how to take this apart without breaking anything?" David nodded proudly. I took pictures of each step so I could put it back together exactly the way it was. Want to see?" He pulled out a tablet and showed her dozens of detailed photographs documenting the disassembly process. Each image was carefully labeled and organized in a way that would allow for precise reconstruction. Instead of scolding him for taking apart expensive property, Maria found herself fascinated by his methodical approach and genuine desire to understand how things worked. "You have an amazing mind," she told him. "But I think we should probably put this back together before your father gets home. Will you help me?" David asked, and there was something vulnerable in his request that went beyond the mechanical task at hand. "Of course," Maria replied, and for the next 2 hours, they worked together to reassemble the piano. David directed the process, explaining what each component did and how it connected to the others. Maria found herself learning more about musical instruments than she had ever imagined, guided by a 7-year-old who possessed an intuitive understanding of complex mechanical systems. When they finished, David played a simple melody to test their work. The piano sounded perfect, and his face lit up with the kind of pure joy that Maria realized she had never seen from him before. It wasn't just satisfaction at completing a task, but genuine happiness at sharing an accomplishment with someone who appreciated both his intelligence and his need for connection. That evening, Maria stayed late to help prepare dinner, wanting to observe the interaction between David and his father when Michael returned from work. What she witnessed broke her heart. The conversation between father and son was polite but distant, filled with the kind of surface-level questions and responses that strangers might exchange. Michael asked about David's studies, and David provided brief, factual answers. David inquired about his father's work, and Michael offered general summaries that revealed nothing personal. Neither of them seemed comfortable with the interaction, but both appeared to be trying their best within the constraints of a relationship that had somehow become formal and cautious. Maria could see love between them, but it was buried under layers of grief, guilt, and mutual uncertainty about how to connect across the emotional distance that had developed since Mrs. Henderson's death. After dinner, Michael retreated to his office to continue working, while David returned to his room with a stack of books. The house settled into its usual evening quiet, with each person isolated in their own space despite being under the same roof. Maria finished her duties and prepared to leave, but she couldn't stop thinking about the brilliant, lonely child who had spent his day taking apart a piano just to understand how it made music. The next morning, Maria arrived to find David waiting for her in the kitchen, already dressed and holding a notebook filled with neat handwriting. "I wrote down some questions," he announced. "About things I've been wondering about. Would you mind if I ask them while you work?" The notebook contained pages of carefully written questions that ranged from practical to philosophical. Why did some cleaning products work better in hot water? What made bubbles round? Did she think plants could feel loneliness? How did people decide what was important enough to worry about? Each question revealed a mind that was constantly processing information and seeking deeper understanding of the world around him. Maria realized that David wasn't just looking for answers to his questions. He was looking for someone who would engage with his curiosity without dismissing it as unusual or inappropriate. He had been surrounded by adults who either couldn't keep up with his intellectual needs or who had been instructed to maintain professional boundaries that prevented real connection. As the days passed, Maria found herself looking forward to these morning conversations as much as David seemed to. She began bringing simple science experiments that she remembered from her own school days, using household items to demonstrate basic principles of chemistry and physics. David absorbed these lessons with enthusiasm, but more importantly, he began to open up about his own thoughts and feelings in ways that suggested he had found someone he could trust. One particularly meaningful conversation occurred while Maria was cleaning the windows in the sunroom. David was helping by handing her supplies and had grown quiet in the way that she was learning meant he was working up the courage to ask something important. "Maria," he said finally, "do you think there's something wrong with me?" The question hit her like a physical blow. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" "I mean, why do all the nannies leave?" David's voice was small and uncertain. "They always start out nice, but then they get frustrated with me. And my dad works all the time, even when he's home. And kids at school think I'm weird because I like different things than they do. Maria set down her cleaning cloth and knelt to David's eye level. There is absolutely nothing wrong with you, she said firmly. You're an extraordinary little boy with an amazing mind and a big heart. Sometimes when people don't understand something special, they don't know how to appreciate it. But why can't I just be normal? David asked, tears forming in his eyes. Why can't I like the same things other kids like? Why do I have to think about everything so much? Because that's who you are, Maria replied gently. And who you are is wonderful. Your mind is a gift, David. The way you see the world and understand things is special. It might feel lonely sometimes, but that doesn't mean there's anything wrong with you. It just means you haven't found the right people who can appreciate how special you are. David was quiet for a long moment, processing her words. Do you really think that? He asked. I know that, Maria said with conviction. And I think your mother knew it too. I bet she was very proud of how smart and curious you are. At the mention of his mother, David's composure cracked completely. I miss her so much, he whispered. She was the only one who understood me. She never thought my questions were too much or that I was too complicated. She used to say that my brain was like a beautiful puzzle that she loved helping me put together. Maria felt tears forming in her own eyes as she pulled David into a gentle hug. She sounds like she was an amazing mom, she said. And I think she would want you to know that you don't have to hide who you are or try to be someone different. The right people will love you exactly as you are. That conversation marked a turning point in their relationship. David began to trust Maria not just with his questions and observations, but with his feelings and fears. He told her about the loneliness he felt at school, where his academic abilities set him apart from his classmates. He shared his frustration with tutors who focused on pushing him academically without caring about his emotional needs. Most painfully, he revealed his growing belief that he was somehow responsible for the distance between himself and his father. Maria listened to all of it with the patience and understanding that David had been desperately needing. She never tried to minimize his feelings or offer simple solutions to complex problems. Instead, she validated his experiences while helping him understand that his intelligence and sensitivity were strengths, not burdens. As Maria learned more about David's inner world, she began to see the true scope of his remarkable gifts. His intelligence wasn't just academic, it was creative, emotional, and intuitive. He could see patterns and connections that others missed, understand complex systems with minimal explanation, and empathize with people and situations in ways that demonstrated extraordinary emotional sophistication. But more than his intellectual abilities, Maria was struck by David's capacity for love and his hunger for genuine connection. Despite all the disappointments he had experienced, he remained open to forming relationships with people who showed him kindness and respect. He was like a flower that had been waiting for the right conditions to bloom, and Maria began to understand that her role in his life might be far more significant than anyone had imagined. The breakthrough moment came on a rainy Thursday afternoon in November. Maria had been working at the Henderson mansion for 6 weeks, and her relationship with David had evolved into something that went far beyond the typical interaction between household staff and family members. What started as casual conversations during her cleaning duties had developed into a genuine friendship built on mutual respect and understanding. David had begun seeking out Maria's company not just for intellectual stimulation, but for the emotional support that he had been missing since his mother's death. He would appear wherever she was working, settling nearby with his books or projects, content to simply be in the presence of someone who accepted him completely. Maria had become his safe harbor in a world that often felt overwhelming and unwelcoming. On this particular afternoon, Maria was organizing the art supply closet in what had once been Mrs. Henderson's studio. The room had been largely untouched since Elizabeth's death, preserved like a shrine to her memory and creative spirit. Canvases lined the walls, some finished paintings of breathtaking beauty and others left incomplete, as if waiting for their creator to return and add the final touches. The air still carried the faint scent of oil paints and turpentine, and afternoon light filtered through large windows that had been designed to provide perfect illumination for artistic work. David had been unusually quiet that morning, declining Maria's invitation to help with her tasks and instead retreating to his room with a stack of advanced mathematics textbooks. She had learned to recognize his moods and understood that sometimes he needed solitude to process whatever was occupying his mind. But when she heard soft footsteps in the hallway outside the studio, she knew he had finally decided to seek out her company. "My mom painted in here," David said from the doorway, his voice carrying a wistfulness that made Maria's heart ache. "She was really good at it. Dad says I have her hands." Maria looked up from the art supplies she was cataloging and saw David examining his own small hands with the kind of scientific curiosity that characterized his approach to everything. "Would you like to see her paintings?" she asked gently. "I think she would have wanted people to appreciate her work." David nodded and stepped into the studio, moving with the reverent care of someone entering a sacred space. He led Maria to a corner where several canvases were stored, carefully wrapped in protective cloth. As he unveiled each painting, Maria found herself amazed by Elizabeth Henderson's talent. The works were predominantly landscapes and portraits, executed with a technical skill that spoke of years of training and practice, but infused with an emotional depth that transformed them from mere representations into windows into the artist's soul. "This one is my favorite," David said, revealing a painting of a garden in full bloom. The image was alive with color and movement, capturing not just the visual beauty of the flowers but somehow conveying the feeling of a perfect spring day. She painted it the summer before she died. She said it reminded her of hope. Maria studied the painting with genuine appreciation, noting the way Elizabeth had used light and shadow to create depth and the subtle color variations that brought each flower to vivid life. "She was incredibly talented," Maria said. "You can see how much love she put into every brushstroke." "I used to watch her paint," David continued, his eyes fixed on the canvas. "She would get this look on her face like she was somewhere else, somewhere beautiful. And she would talk to me while she worked, explaining what she was doing and why. She said painting was like solving a puzzle, but instead of finding the right answer, you were creating something that had never existed before." Something in David's tone caught Maria's attention. There was a longing in his voice that went beyond simple grief for his lost mother. "Did you ever want to try painting yourself?" she asked. David shrugged, but Maria could see the interest flickering in his eyes. "Dad put all her supplies away after she died. He said it was too painful to see them being used." "Maybe he just needed time," Maria suggested carefully. "Grief affects people differently, and sometimes what feels impossible at first becomes healing later on." David was quiet for a moment, still staring at his mother's painting. Then, almost in a whisper, he said, "I dream about colors sometimes. Not just regular colors, but colors that don't have names. And I see pictures in my head that I wish I could show people, but I don't know how." The statement sent a chill down Maria's spine. There was something in David's voice that suggested he was sharing something profound, something that went to the core of who he was. "What kind of pictures?" she asked softly. "All kinds," David replied, his eyes beginning to shine with excitement as he found someone willing to listen to thoughts he had never been able to express. "Sometimes I see how math problems would look if they were paintings. Like, a complicated equation might look like a storm with lightning that follows specific patterns. Or I'll think about a piece of music and see it as colors moving through space." Maria felt her breath catch. What David was describing sounded like synesthesia, a neurological phenomenon where the stimulation of one sensory pathway led to automatic, involuntary experiences in another. She had read about it in college, but had never met anyone who experienced it firsthand. If David was seeing mathematical concepts as visual art and hearing music as moving colors, it would explain so much about his unique way of processing information. "David," she said carefully, "when you see these pictures in your head, do they always look the same? Like, if you think about the same math problem twice, do you see the same storm?" David nodded eagerly. "Yes, exactly. And different numbers have different colors. 7 is always yellow-orange, like a sunset. 3 is deep blue, like the ocean. And when you multiply them together, the colors mix and create something new." Maria's heart began to race as she realized the implications of what David was revealing. His extraordinary intelligence wasn't just academic, it was fundamentally different from how most people processed information. He was literally seeing and experiencing concepts in ways that allowed him to understand complex relationships and patterns that would be invisible to others. "Have you ever told anyone else about this?" Maria asked. "I tried to tell one of my tutors once," David said, his expression growing dejected. "But he said I was just being imaginative and that I needed to focus on the real work instead of daydreaming." "And my dad?" His voice trailed off. "Your dad what?" "My dad gets this worried look when I say things he doesn't understand. Like he's afraid there's something wrong with me. So I stopped talking about the pictures." Maria felt a surge of protective anger toward all the adults who had dismissed David's extraordinary gift as mere childish imagination. They had been so focused on his challenging behavior and advanced intellect that they had completely missed the most remarkable aspect of his mind. David wasn't just gifted, he possessed a rare neurological trait that gave him a unique way of perceiving and understanding the world. "David," she said, keeping her voice calm despite her excitement, "there's nothing wrong with you. What you're describing is called synesthesia, and it's actually quite special. Some of the most creative and brilliant people in history have experienced the world the way you do." David's eyes widened. "Really? There are other people who see numbers as colors?" "Yes, and they've used that gift to create amazing art, music, and scientific discoveries. Your brain is wired in a way that lets you see connections and patterns that other people miss. That's why you're so good at understanding how things work." For the first time since Maria had known him, David looked genuinely excited about something related to his own abilities. "Could I learn to paint the pictures I see? Could I show other people what math problems look like in my head? I think you could create some of the most amazing art anyone has ever seen," Maria said with complete sincerity. "But we would need to ask your father if it's okay to use your mother's supplies." David's expression fell slightly. "He won't understand. He'll think I'm just playing around or trying to replace Mom." "Let me talk to him," Maria said impulsively. "Sometimes grown-ups need help understanding things too. Maybe if I explain it the right way, he'll see how important this is." That evening, Maria waited until David had gone to bed before approaching Michael in his study. She had never initiated a personal conversation with her employer before, and she felt nervous about overstepping her boundaries. But the discovery of David's synesthesia felt too important to ignore, and she knew that without adult support, his gift might remain hidden forever. Michael looked up from his laptop when she knocked on the open door, his expression shifting from surprise to polite attention. "Maria, is everything all right? Do you need something for tomorrow?" "Actually, Mr. Henderson, I wanted to talk to you about David," Maria said, stepping into the room but remaining standing. "I've discovered something about him that I think you should know." Michael's expression immediately became guarded, and Maria could see the tension that entered his posture. She realized that he was probably expecting another report of difficult behavior or evidence that David was becoming a problem for the household staff. "What kind of something?" he asked carefully. Maria took a deep breath and launched into an explanation of synesthesia, describing the neurological phenomenon in terms that a businessman could understand. She explained how David's brain created cross-sensory connections that allowed him to perceive mathematical concepts as visual art and musical compositions as moving colors. She described the sophisticated way he had analyzed the piano's mechanics and his intuitive understanding of complex systems. As she spoke, Michael's expression shifted from weariness to amazement to something that looked almost like grief. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands folded on the desk. "His mother had something similar," Michael said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "She used to tell me that she could see music as paintings and that mathematical equations reminded her of dance choreography. I never really understood what she meant, but it was part of what made her art so extraordinary." Maria felt her heart break for this man who had been living with his son for 4 years without recognizing that the boy had inherited one of his wife's most remarkable traits. "David sees the world the same way she did," Maria said gently. "But he's been afraid to talk about it because he thinks it makes him strange. God, Michael breathed, running his hands through his hair. How could I have missed something so important? How could I have let him think there was something wrong with him when he's actually carrying on Elizabeth's gift? You've been grieving, Maria said compassionately. And David has been acting out in ways that made it hard to see past the surface behavior. But now that we know, we can help him understand and develop his abilities. Michael looked up at her with an expression of gratitude mixed with shame. What do you think we should do? I think we should let him paint, Maria said simply. Let him use his mother's studio and supplies to create the pictures he sees in his mind. I think it might be exactly what he needs to start healing. The next morning, Michael did something he hadn't done in months. Instead of leaving for work immediately after breakfast, he asked David to join him in the art studio. Maria watched from the hallway as father and son stood together in the room that had been closed off like a tomb for 2 years. Maria tells me you see pictures in your head, Michael said, his voice gentle but uncertain. Pictures of math problems and music. David glanced toward the doorway where Maria stood, seeking reassurance. When she nodded encouragingly, he turned back to his father. Sometimes, he admitted cautiously. I know it sounds weird. It doesn't sound weird at all, Michael said, and Maria could hear the emotion he was struggling to control. Your mother used to see the same kinds of pictures. She said it was how she knew which colors to use in her paintings. David's eyes grew wide. Really? Mom saw numbers as colors too? She did. And I think she would have loved to know that you inherited that gift from her. Michael gestured toward the art supplies that Maria had organized the day before. Would you like to try painting some of the pictures you see? The transformation in David was immediate and profound. His usual careful caution melted away, replaced by an excitement that seemed to illuminate him from within. Could I really? Would it be okay? More than okay, Michael said, and for the first time since Maria had known him, his smile looked completely genuine. I think it's exactly what this room has been waiting for. What happened next exceeded everyone's expectations. David approached the easel with the focused intensity that characterized everything he did, but this time his concentration was driven by joy rather than isolation. He selected brushes and colors with the confidence of someone who had been born knowing exactly what tools he needed, and when he began to paint, it was as if he was translating a language that only he could read. The first painting emerged quickly, a swirling composition of blues and golds that pulsed with mathematical precision. David explained as he worked that he was painting the multiplication table, showing how each number had its own color and how they combined to create new hues when multiplied together. The result was unlike anything Maria had ever seen, a work of art that was simultaneously beautiful and educational, emotional and logical. Over the following days, David painted with the fervor of someone who had finally found their voice. He created visual representations of musical compositions, showing how Beethoven's symphonies looked like thunderstorms and how Mozart's piano sonatas resembled dancing butterflies. He painted algebraic equations as architectural structures and geometric theorems as abstract landscapes. Each painting was more remarkable than the last, demonstrating not just David's synesthetic abilities but his incredible artistic talent. He had inherited his mother's technical skill along with her unique way of perceiving the world, and the combination resulted in art that was both scientifically accurate and emotionally moving. More importantly, the act of painting seemed to heal something fundamental in David's spirit. The angry, destructive behavior that had driven away 5 nannies disappeared completely, replaced by a focused creativity that channeled all his intelligence and energy into positive expression. He still asked endless questions and made complex observations, but now he had a way to share his inner world with others. Michael began spending time in the studio each evening, watching David work and asking questions about what he was creating. These conversations brought father and son together in a way that nothing else had been able to accomplish. David would explain the mathematical concepts behind his paintings, while Michael shared stories about Elizabeth's artistic process and the conversations they had shared about her synesthetic experiences. The change in their relationship was remarkable. The formal distance that had characterized their interactions melted away as they discovered common ground in their shared connection to Elizabeth's memory and David's emerging artistic identity. Michael began to see his son not as a problem to be solved, but as a unique individual with extraordinary gifts that deserved to be celebrated and nurtured. Maria watched these developments with a satisfaction that went beyond professional pride. She had not only helped David discover his artistic abilities, but had facilitated a healing process that was bringing the entire family back together. The lonely, brilliant boy who had once taken apart pianos in search of understanding had found a way to share his internal landscape with the world. Word of David's unusual artistic abilities began to spread beyond the Henderson household. Michael had shown some of the paintings to colleagues, who were amazed by the sophisticated mathematical concepts rendered in such beautiful visual form. An art professor from Harvard who saw the work described it as the most remarkable example of synesthetic art he had encountered in decades of study. But perhaps the most meaningful validation came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Patterson, the household manager who had worked for the family since before David was born, spent an afternoon studying his paintings with tears in her eyes. "It's like having Elizabeth back," she told Maria quietly. "Not just because of the artistic talent, but because of the way he sees beauty in everything, even things that most people think are boring or difficult." That's exactly how she was. The studio became the heart of the Henderson home in a way it hadn't been since Elizabeth's death. David would paint for hours each day, completely absorbed in translating his internal visions into visual reality. Michael would join him in the evenings, and they would discuss not just the paintings but the ideas and emotions behind them. The room that had once been a shrine to loss became a celebration of continuing creativity and family connection. Maria's role in the household evolved naturally as David's artistic development became a central focus of family life. She found herself serving not just as cleaning staff, but as a facilitator and supporter of David's creative process. She learned to prepare canvases, organize supplies, and document his work with photographs that captured not just the finished paintings but the joy on his face as he created them. More importantly, she became the bridge between David's unique way of experiencing the world and the adults who were trying to understand and support him. When tutors or other professionals needed to grasp how David's synesthesia affected his learning, Maria could translate his experiences into terms they could comprehend. When Michael struggled to connect with his son's artistic vision, Maria helped facilitate conversations that brought them closer together. The discovery of David's synesthetic abilities had implications that extended far beyond art. His teachers began to understand why traditional educational approaches had failed to engage him and started developing learning strategies that incorporated visual elements and cross-sensory connections. Math problems became more meaningful when David could paint them, and historical events came alive when he could create artistic representations of how they looked in his mind. But perhaps most importantly, David himself began to understand that his differences were not defects to be hidden but gifts to be celebrated. The loneliness and self-doubt that had characterized his early years gave way to confidence and excitement about his unique abilities. He stopped trying to fit in with other children his age and instead began to appreciate the special way his mind worked. The transformation was so complete that visitors to the Henderson home often commented on the dramatic change in atmosphere. Where once there had been tension and sadness, there was now creativity and joy. The house felt alive again, filled with the sounds of David explaining his latest painting or Michael asking questions about synesthetic experiences. Maria understood that she had witnessed something extraordinary. Through patience, understanding, and genuine curiosity about David's inner world, she had helped unlock a gift that might have remained hidden forever. But more than that, she had helped heal a family that had been broken by loss and misunderstanding. As winter turned to spring, David's artistic development continued to accelerate. His paintings became more sophisticated and complex, incorporating multiple mathematical concepts and musical elements into single compositions. He began experimenting with different media, creating sculptures that represented three-dimensional algebraic relationships and digital art that showed how computer code looked in his synesthetic perception. The boy who had once driven away 5 nannies with his challenging behavior had become a source of wonder and inspiration for everyone who met him. Teachers sought out his family to learn about synesthetic learning techniques. Art collectors expressed interest in his work. Educational researchers wanted to study his unique abilities. But for Maria, the greatest reward was seeing the happiness in David's eyes and the growing bond between father and son. She had come to the Henderson mansion looking for a job that would help support her family. Instead, she had discovered her calling as someone who could see past surface behaviors to recognize the extraordinary potential that lay beneath. The maid who had been hired to clean house had ended up cleaning away years of misunderstanding and isolation, revealing the brilliant, creative, loving child who had been waiting for someone to truly see him. In doing so, she had not only changed David's life, but had helped restore a family that had nearly lost itself to grief and distance. As she watched David paint his latest masterpiece, a visual representation of how laughter sounded in mathematical terms, Maria knew that this was just the beginning of his journey. With his gift finally recognized and nurtured, there was no limit to what this remarkable child might accomplish. The boy who saw the world in colors that had no names was finally ready to share his vision with everyone around him. 6 months after David's first brushstroke touched canvas, the Henderson mansion had transformed into something none of them could have imagined. The sterile perfection that once characterized the house had given way to a living, breathing space filled with creativity and genuine warmth. David's paintings adorn the walls throughout the home, each one a window into his extraordinary mind and a testament to the healing power of understanding and acceptance. The art studio, once a painful reminder of loss, had become the vibrant center of family life. David spent hours there each day, lost in the joy of translating his synesthetic visions into visual reality. His artistic skills had developed at an astonishing pace, guided by an intuitive understanding of color, composition, and mathematical harmony that left professional artists speechless. But more than technical proficiency, his work carried an emotional depth that spoke to something universal in the human experience. Michael had commissioned a professional photographer to document David's artistic journey, creating a visual record of each painting along with David's own explanations of what mathematical concepts or musical compositions had inspired them. The resulting portfolio was unlike anything in the art world, a unique fusion of scientific accuracy and emotional expression that challenged traditional boundaries between analytical and creative thinking. Word of David's extraordinary abilities had spread far beyond their immediate circle. Dr. Patricia Williams, a renowned neuroscientist specializing in synesthesia research, had reached out after hearing about David's work through academic networks. She requested permission to study his artistic process as part of a broader research project on the relationship between synesthetic perception and creative expression. The meeting with Dr. Williams marked a turning point in how the family understood David's gift. Rather than seeing his synesthesia as an interesting quirk, they began to appreciate it as a rare neurological trait that occurred in less than 4% of the population. Dr. Williams explained that David's particular type of synesthesia, involving multiple sensory crossovers, was even rarer and often associated with exceptional creative and analytical abilities. David's brain forms connections that most people's brains simply don't make, Dr. Williams explained during her visit to the studio. When he sees mathematical equations as visual art, he's literally experiencing math in a way that allows him to understand relationships and patterns that might take other people years to grasp intellectually. She spent hours with David, documenting his artistic process and interviewing him about his synesthetic experiences. What she discovered exceeded her expectations. David's synesthesia wasn't limited to numbers and colors. He experienced textures as sounds, emotions as geometric shapes, and even social interactions as complex visual patterns. His brain was creating a rich, multidimensional map of reality that gave him insights into everything from human behavior to abstract mathematical concepts. This child has one of the most sophisticated synesthetic profiles I've ever encountered, Dr. Williams told Michael privately. His artistic work isn't just beautiful, it's scientifically significant. He's visually representing mathematical and musical concepts in ways that could revolutionize how we teach these subjects. The validation from the scientific community gave Michael a new perspective on his son's future. He began to envision possibilities that went far beyond traditional academic achievement. David's unique gifts could lead him toward groundbreaking work in fields that bridged art and science, from data visualization to neuroscience research to educational innovation. But perhaps more importantly, David himself was flourishing in ways that had nothing to do with external recognition. The angry, isolated child who had driven away 5 caregivers had evolved into a confident, joyful young artist who eagerly shared his vision with anyone willing to listen. His paintings had given him a voice for experiences that had previously been impossible to communicate, and that voice was transforming not just his own life but the lives of everyone around him. Maria watched these developments with deep satisfaction, knowing that her intuition about David's hidden gifts had been proven correct in ways she could never have anticipated. But her role in the family's transformation was far from over. As David's artistic abilities gained recognition, new challenges emerged that required her continued support and advocacy. The question of David's education became increasingly complex as his synesthetic abilities developed. Traditional schools struggled to accommodate a child whose learning style was so fundamentally different from standard approaches. Math teachers couldn't understand why David needed to paint equations before he could solve them. English instructors were baffled by his insistence that different authors had distinct color signatures that affected how he interpreted their work. Maria found herself serving as an interpreter between David's unique needs and the educational professionals who were trying to serve him. She attended meetings with teachers and administrators, helping them understand how synesthetic perception affected David's learning process and advocating for accommodations that would allow him to demonstrate his knowledge in ways that aligned with his neurological profile. One particularly memorable conference involved David's mathematics tutor, who had initially been skeptical of what she considered artistic distractions from serious academic work. Maria arranged for David to demonstrate his problem-solving process by painting a complex algebraic equation while explaining his reasoning. As the visual representation took shape on canvas, the tutor began to understand that David wasn't using art as a crutch for mathematical thinking. He was revealing mathematical relationships that were invisible to conventional approaches. "I've been teaching mathematics for 25 years, the tutor admitted afterward, and I've never seen anyone demonstrate such intuitive understanding of abstract concepts. He's not just solving problems, he's showing us what mathematical beauty actually looks like." This breakthrough led to a complete revision of David's educational plan. Instead of trying to force him into traditional learning modalities, his teachers began incorporating visual and artistic elements into every subject. History lessons became mural projects showing how different time periods looked to David's synesthetic perception. Science experiments were followed by artistic interpretations that revealed David's understanding of underlying principles. Even literature analysis involved David creating visual representations of how different literary techniques affected his sensory experience of texts. The results were remarkable. David's academic performance soared as teachers learned to work with his synesthetic abilities rather than against them. More importantly, he began to enjoy learning in ways that had been impossible when his unique perceptual style was seen as a barrier rather than an asset. Michael's relationship with his son continued to deepen as they explored David's artistic development together. They established a routine of spending time in the studio each evening, with David working on his latest painting while Michael asked questions about the synesthetic experiences that inspired each piece. These conversations became a form of meditation for both of them, a way of connecting not just with each other but with the memory of Elizabeth and her own synesthetic gifts. One evening, as David worked on a particularly complex piece representing the mathematical concept of infinity, Michael found himself thinking about the journey that had brought them to this moment. Less than a year earlier, he had been a desperate father convinced that his son was irreparably damaged by grief and behavioral problems. Now he was watching that same child create art that professional critics were calling revolutionary. "Do you remember when you used to take apart everything in the house?" Michael asked, settling into a chair beside David's easel. David paused his painting and smiled at the memory. "I was trying to understand how things worked. But I couldn't explain what I was seeing inside my head, so everyone thought I was just being destructive." "I'm sorry I didn't understand," Michael said quietly. "I should have seen that you were trying to communicate something important." "You couldn't have known," David replied with a wisdom that seemed far beyond his 8 years. "Maria was the first person who listened to what I was really saying instead of just seeing what I was doing wrong." The mention of Maria reminded Michael of how much their family owed to the young woman who had started as simple household staff and become something far more significant. Her patience, insight, and genuine caring had unlocked David's potential in ways that no trained professional had been able to achieve. She had seen past his challenging behavior to recognize the brilliant, sensitive child underneath, and her belief in him had made all the difference. As David's artistic reputation grew, opportunities began presenting themselves that none of them had anticipated. A children's museum in Boston requested permission to display some of his work as part of an exhibition on neurodiversity and creativity. A mathematics textbook publisher asked if David's visual representations could be included in materials designed to help students understand abstract concepts. Educational researchers wanted to study his learning process to develop new teaching methods for synesthetic students. Each opportunity was carefully considered with David's well-being as the primary concern. Michael had learned from watching other child prodigies that fame and external pressure could be destructive if not managed properly. The family established clear boundaries around David's artistic work, ensuring that he remained in control of what he shared publicly and that his childhood remained protected despite his extraordinary abilities. Maria played a crucial role in maintaining these boundaries. Her natural protectiveness toward David, combined with her understanding of his emotional needs, made her an excellent advocate for keeping his best interests at the forefront of every decision. When exhibition organizers pushed for more paintings than David was comfortable creating, Maria helped the family navigate the negotiations. When researchers requested access that might have been overwhelming, she suggested alternatives that would allow for scientific study while preserving David's privacy. But perhaps Maria's most important contribution was helping David understand that his worth wasn't defined by his artistic abilities or the recognition they brought. She continued to engage with him as a whole person, celebrating his achievements while also valuing his questions, his sense of humor, and his growing empathy for others. Her consistent presence and unconditional acceptance provided the emotional stability that allowed David to develop his gifts without losing sight of who he was beyond his talents. The impact of David's story began to extend beyond their immediate family. Other parents of children with learning differences reached out, seeking advice and support for their own struggles with educational systems that didn't accommodate neurodiversity. Maria found herself fielding phone calls from families across the country who had heard about David's journey and hoped to find similar understanding for their own children. One particularly meaningful contact came from Mrs. Rodriguez, the mother of a 10-year-old girl with synesthesia who had been struggling in traditional school settings. The girl's teachers had dismissed her claims about seeing colors and numbers as attention-seeking behavior, and her academic performance was suffering as a result. Maria arranged for the family to visit the Henderson home, where David eagerly demonstrated his painting techniques and explained how he had learned to use his synesthetic abilities as tools for learning rather than barriers to overcome. The girl's face lit up as she realized she wasn't alone in her perceptual experiences, and her mother wept with relief at finally finding someone who understood her daughter's challenges. "You've given us hope," Mrs. Rodriguez told Maria as they prepared to leave. "For the first time, I feel like my daughter's differences might be gifts instead of problems." This encounter inspired Maria to propose a more formal way of supporting other families facing similar challenges. Working with Michael and Dr. Williams, she helped establish a support network for parents of synesthetic children, providing resources, advocacy training, and connections to educational professionals who understood neurodiversity. The network grew rapidly as word spread through online communities and professional networks. Parents shared strategies for working with schools, connected with researchers studying synesthesia, and most importantly, helped their children understand that their unique perceptual abilities were valuable rather than problematic. David became an unofficial ambassador for synesthetic awareness, though always with careful attention to his comfort level and emotional needs. He participated in video conferences with other synesthetic children, sharing his artistic techniques and encouraging them to explore their own creative potential. His enthusiasm for his synesthetic abilities was infectious, helping other children see their differences as sources of strength rather than reasons for shame. 1 year after David had created his first painting, the Henderson family organized a celebration that brought together everyone who had been part of their journey. The guest list included Dr. Williams and her research team, David's teachers and tutors, families from the support network, and of course, Maria's own family, who had watched with pride as their daughter helped transform the lives of others. The event was held in the mansion's garden, with David's paintings displayed on easels throughout the outdoor space. Each piece told part of the story of his artistic development, from the simple color experiments of his early work to the sophisticated mathematical visualizations that had earned recognition from academic institutions around the world. As guests moved through the garden, studying the visual representations of David's synesthetic experiences, Maria found herself reflecting on the unlikely journey that had brought them all together. She had taken a job as household staff, never imagining that she would become instrumental in discovering and nurturing one of the most remarkable artistic gifts of her generation. But more than David's artistic success, she was proud of the personal growth she had witnessed in him. The lonely, angry child who had once destroyed property in desperate attempts to communicate had become a confident, empathetic young artist who used his gifts to help others understand the beauty of different ways of experiencing the world. Michael approached Maria as the celebration was winding down, carrying a small wrapped package. "This is for you," he said simply. "A token of our gratitude for everything you've given our family." Inside the package was a photograph of David's first painting, the swirling representation of the multiplication table that had marked the beginning of his artistic journey. But it was the inscription on the back that brought tears to Maria's eyes, "To Maria, who saw my colors before I knew I had them. Thank you for helping me find my voice. Love, David." "You know this isn't really about the painting, don't you?" Michael said quietly. "What you gave David wasn't just the opportunity to create art. You gave him the belief that who he is fundamentally is enough. That's a gift that will shape the rest of his life." Maria looked across the garden to where David was demonstrating his painting technique to a group of younger children, his face animated with joy and enthusiasm. The boy who had once been considered impossible to handle was now inspiring others to embrace their own uniqueness. "He taught me just as much as I taught him," Maria replied. "David showed me that sometimes the most challenging behaviors are really the most important communications. If we're patient enough to listen and curious enough to understand, we might discover something extraordinary." As the evening progressed, David surprised everyone by unveiling a new painting he had created specifically for the celebration. Unlike his previous work, which had focused on mathematical and musical concepts, this piece was a portrait of the garden party itself. Using his synesthetic abilities, he had captured not just the visual elements of the gathering but the emotional resonance of the moment. The painting showed figures representing each person who had played a role in his journey, rendered in colors that reflected their emotional significance to him. Maria appeared as a warm golden figure surrounded by gentle blues and greens, while his father was depicted in strong reds and purples that conveyed both love and protection. Dr. Williams appeared in bright whites and silvers that suggested scientific clarity, while the other children were painted in rainbow hues that represented potential and possibility. "This is how today feels to me," David explained to the gathered crowd. "Not just what it looks like, but what it means. All of you are part of the picture now, part of the story of how I learned that being different can be beautiful." The painting was David's way of acknowledging that his artistic gift was not a solitary achievement but the result of a community of people who had recognized his potential and supported his development. From Maria's initial patience and curiosity to his father's willingness to embrace his unique learning style to Dr. Williams's scientific validation of his abilities, each person had contributed something essential to his journey. As the celebration concluded and guests began to depart, Maria lingered in the garden, taking a moment to appreciate how much had changed since that first morning when she had knocked on the Henderson mansion's door. She had come seeking employment that would help support her family's financial needs. Instead, she had discovered her calling as someone who could see potential where others saw only problems. The skills she had developed in understanding and supporting David had applications far beyond their specific situation. Through the support network they had established and the advocacy work she had become involved in, Maria was now helping families across the country navigate similar challenges with neurodivergent children. She had also made a decision that would have seemed impossible a year earlier. With Michael's encouragement and financial support, Maria had enrolled in courses to complete her education degree, specializing in neurodiversity and alternative learning approaches. Her experience with David had shown her that traditional educational methods often failed children whose minds worked differently, and she wanted to be part of the solution. The future looked bright for all of them. David's artistic abilities continued to develop, with galleries expressing interest in exhibiting his work and educational institutions seeking to incorporate his visual teaching methods into their curricula. But more importantly, he was growing into a confident, compassionate young person who understood the value of his unique gifts while remaining grounded in the love and support of his family. Michael had learned to balance his professional responsibilities with his role as a father, finding joy in David's development that gave new meaning to his own success. The distance that had once characterized their relationship had been replaced by genuine connection built on understanding and shared exploration of David's remarkable abilities. Maria's own family had been transformed by her experiences as well. The financial stability provided by her position with the Hendersons had allowed her father to receive better medical care and her mother to reduce her working hours. But beyond the practical benefits, Maria's confidence and sense of purpose had inspired her younger siblings to pursue their own educational goals with renewed determination. As she prepared to leave the garden that evening, Maria took one last look at David's paintings illuminated by the soft glow of garden lights. Each canvas represented not just an artistic achievement but a moment of connection between a remarkable child and the world around him. They were visual proof that understanding and acceptance could unlock potential that might otherwise remain hidden forever. The boy who had once been considered impossible to handle had become a source of inspiration for families around the world. His story had shown that children who seemed most challenging might actually be the most gifted, waiting for someone patient enough to listen and wise enough to see past surface behaviors to the extraordinary possibilities beneath. Maria's journey from household staff to educational advocate had taught her that the most profound changes often begin with the simplest acts of kindness and understanding. By choosing to see David's questions as curiosity rather than defiance, his intense focus as passion rather than obsession, and his emotional sensitivity as depth rather than instability, she had helped unlock gifts that were now touching lives far beyond their original circle. The maid who had discovered a child's incredible gift had, in the process, discovered her own calling as someone who could help others recognize and nurture the hidden potential in every child. It was a legacy that would continue to grow as more families learned that the greatest gifts sometimes come in the most unexpected packages, waiting for someone with the wisdom to recognize their true value. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.